Hey everybody. So this coming weekend is the first ever Disney Lorcana North American Championship Tournament in Anaheim, California, and I am super excited. Not only that the event is taking place and we get to see some of the very best Lorcana we're ever going to see with the best of the best players going at it, but I'm really humbled and excited that I get to be a part of the commentary team for this event. I've had the opportunity to do 5 of the 6 Disney Lorcana challenges as either an on-site or remote commentator, and it's been a fantastic experience. One of the things I try to do going into each event is to make each event better than the last in terms of my preparation, my approach, and just my performance on site. This event is absolutely no exception. I've been doing my very best to get ready, studying, and doing a lot to prepare, but I wanted to take a moment. I thought it'd be fun to give you a look at how I'm preparing, talk you through, how I'm getting ready, my mindset going into this, so you understand a lot of what goes into a successful broadcast, at least from a commentator perspective. And I know that a lot of my fellow commentators are doing the same thing to get ready. So let's dive in. So before I talk about prep, I do want to mention my background. I don't have a long history with TCG commentary. Lorcana is the first game that I'm actively creating content for, although I've been playing TCGs pretty much all my life. I did have the opportunity to do several TCG events, such as TCG Con Houston, Hunter Burton, 1Ks, and several other events that I commentated as part of my channel. But the DLC in Atlanta was the first major event that I had the opportunity to do as part of a Lorcana commentary team. I jumped in head first, learned a lot from more experienced commentators like Tan and Grace, who kind of showed me the ropes, and I just try to make each event better than the last. So you have to understand that I haven't done this professionally for years. It's new with Disney Lorcana challenges, so I had a very steep learning curve. But I really looked at that learning curve as a challenge and an opportunity to grow both personally and professionally. So it's been a pleasure growing and getting better with each and every challenge. So what's going on to preparing for this weekend's event? I'm going to break it down into several parts, and the first part is probably the most obvious one, and that is game and meta knowledge. Obviously, as a TCG commentator, your most important job is to explain the games that people are watching to the audience. And you have to do this on several different levels. You obviously want to be able to explain to the average viewer, the average Lorcana player in terms of skill, what's going on, to explain the flow of the game, why players are making certain decisions, etc. But you also want to have some nuggets for those hyper-competitive players, quite a few nuggets if you can manage them. You do have to mix these explanations together to provide both levels of player the type of analysis that'll make them happy and that will allow them to follow the game, and give them something to take away to their own gameplay. And the only way you can do this is if you understand the meta, if you understand the popular meta decks, why certain cards are in there, which decks are better into certain matchups, how decks operate on the play and on the draw, why players are making certain tech decisions. All of these things I think are kind of common sense, but these are all the things that you really have to have a deep understanding of. And frankly, this kind of knowledge only comes from study. It comes from monitoring recent tournaments to watch how the meta has shifted over time, to look at deck lists, to understand why things are changing. Because the other people watching those tournament results are the competitive players that you're going to be commentating on. They're watching the exact same things. So if you understand those tournament results and how things are shifting and moving and why players are making certain choices, you can understand what those players are thinking. You also have to watch, honestly, as many games as you can, whether they're commentated or casted or not. You have to watch how players play on the play and on the draw. You have to understand their decision making. And if you do that enough, then eventually as you're watching a game, you'll kind of understand the way players are thinking, what they're digging for, why their game style changes, play, draw, etc. You learn to predict what's in players' hands. In many ways, it's like competitive players study. It's doing the exact same thing that competitive players are doing, but I'm not going to play in the tournament, I'm going to commentate. But I have to prepare as if I were going to play. Other things that I'm doing is looking at new meta builds for cards that perhaps I haven't seen quite as often. Cards from set 6 which are appearing in decks for the first time, maybe some off-the-wall cards that are being worked into some niche decks, because sometimes I will see those cards played and I want to be able to know what they are from the picture rather than having to read it, because there's nothing more awkward than a card being played and the commentator's pausing for a moment while they try to figure out what exactly that is. It's not bad, because oftentimes if you don't know what it is, the average viewer doesn't know what it is either, and so you have this fun moment where you're kind of experiencing that together. You don't want to do that too often though. We did have this experience, of course, in Atlanta when Zach Bivens brought in Jiminy Cricket, and all of us were kind of shocked and had to look for a moment and figure out what exactly that was doing. But anyway, it can make for some fun moments, but you really want to know the cards on site. It's the professional thing to do, obviously. And there's other ways you can gain intimate understandings from decks. One thing you can do is talk to competitive players themselves. Call them up, interview them, talk to them about their builds, why they're doing certain things. I try to do this as much as I possibly can with players that I know that are playing in tournaments I'm about to commentate. Oftentimes, if they trust that we will keep that information to ourselves, to not give away anything that they're going to bring in or any of their spiciness, they'll tell us things and help us understand what we might see the day of, because they really want a good broadcast for all of you. They want all of you to have a good experience watching the tournament that they're playing in, and so they'll give us some tips and help us understand why things are going the way they are. There's another way that you can learn from pro players as well, and that's by looking at their deck guides or their Metafy accounts or getting coaching sessions, for example. So there's a lot of really good players who publish guides on Metafy or other places where they give really detailed breakdowns of decks and matchups and meta choices and how to play on the draw and on the play and all of that. They're great. So a perfect example for Ruby Sapphire, Sailor on Team Labyrinth is a player who's well known for piloting that deck and has been playing it for many, many sets. Publishes a fantastic guide, keeps it updated, and it's a great place to go to understand that deck and its matchups. Same with Kendall Burdett and Ruby Amethyst. He's a player who's well known for that deck and updates his guide consistently. Then there's Dale Bellido with Emerald Steel. So if you find these players who are known for specific archetypes, you know exactly where to go to understand specific decks. And you can generally pick these players' brains either through guides that they've published or even hiring them for coaching sessions. It's a fantastic way to learn. And this leads me to part 2, which is phrasing and storytelling. You know, understanding the game, the decks, the meta, how things play, etc., are only part of the equation when it comes to commentary. The other thing you want to be able to do is to tell a story and to communicate things in a way that people may not have thought of before. Different players have different ways of viewing the game or experiencing certain interactions or matchups, etc. And when you talk to them and you kind of pick their brains and dig a little bit, sometimes by asking them questions that you already know the answer to, they may explain things to you in ways that you don't expect that is super helpful for people watching or that they might find interesting. And sometimes these players don't even realize that they're thinking in this different way, but as they're explaining it to you, they realize it themselves. You know, I was talking to a player this weekend, Aaron Rubin, who's a very, very good player, and he was explaining a Ruby deck and Ruby Amethyst and why it's so good. And he explained it. He said, you know, have you played Star Wars, the new Star Wars Unlimited TCG? And I was like, well, yes, I have. He's like, so you know in that game that there's 2 different lanes, there's like or 2 different zones, and I haven't only played this a couple times, but there's like the space zone and there's the ground zone, and you have units who exist in both and they fight in both. He's like, I like to think of Ruby Amethyst the same way, or even Lorcana the same way, but it's very important in Ruby Amethyst, and that is that there's 2 different zones that you're fighting in. There's the evasive zone and then there's the non-evasive zone. And one of the reasons that Ruby Amethyst is so good is it's very good in both of those zones. And I'd never quite thought of it that way. In Magic, of course, you have a similar thing with flyers and non-flyers, but I'd never quite thought of it as, you know, 2 different zones that exist independently. And yes, they do interact, but that Ruby Amethyst is good in both zones. Now, this might not be the ideal way to describe it, but it's interesting knowing that that's a way that somebody thinks about this deck. And sometimes, you know, that may resonate with certain people. So that's probably an explanation that I'll pick up and use this weekend. And I can think of a ton of different examples of that, because ultimately casting a game is about storytelling. That's what makes it fun. It's about understanding the script of a game, how it's likely to play out based on the matchup and based on the players. And it's about explaining to the audience how that's going to work from the start of the game to the mid game to the end game. And the more tools that you have at your disposal, like these different zones to explain how this match is going to play out, to paint a picture, the better job you can do, and the more you can vary your commentating from match to match to match. Watching other commentators, of course, helps with this because they have ways of explaining things and interacting with the audience that are unique to them, but that you can kind of pick things from. The one thing I will say, though, is you obviously don't want to take their thing, right? I would never at this point sing Be Prepared like Baker does over in Europe, or if I did, I would credit him with it because it's clearly his thing at this point. There's also things that Spessy says. There's certain phrases that he has, which I love, and I might use once or twice, but I'm not going to try to make it that thing my thing because it's Spessy's thing, and he's very good at those particular phrases. So one thing you can get from watching other commentators, though, I will say, is a sense of confidence. It is really fun listening to Baker or other commentators just be themselves and do those fun, quirky things. And it gives you the confidence to inhabit that mentality as well, to kind of be open and free and be yourself and have a little bit of humor and banter with the audience. So anyway, storytelling, phrasing, that's part 2. It's something to work on. And although the knowledge of the game provides the base. The icing that you kind of put on top of it is the phrasing, the storytelling, and how you word things. Part 3 we'll call ancillary knowledge or trivia. Step 1 is obviously learning the meta, the decks, everything else, as we already said. Part 2 is to work on your phrasing and your approach and the way you talk about things. Part 3 is kind of, let's call it trivia. I think what makes commentary super, super interesting is not only if during matches and between matches, you can talk about the flow of the game, the meta, all that competitive play, but you can sprinkle in some little tidbits from the game design, perhaps about the players, that really help you tell an even better story. For example, if a player comes up to the table and I can talk about, hey, this player is known for this particular deck, or this player finished first in this particular tournament, or this player is qualified for the top cut 4 times and only made it as high as the top 16. This player is from Europe. This player is from, I don't know, there's 1,000 different things. And trivia about the players isn't the only bit of knowledge that you can sprinkle throughout the broadcast. Now, I know that there are competitive players who like things to remain very competitive focused without any of this other ancillary stuff, but I do think that bits of trivia and knowledge about card art, about the history of specific cards, about Disney even, about Disney movies, can make for a really compelling broadcast if you use them in the right place and the right time. There are times where things are a little bit slow, and I think it's really fun to offer a fact about an artist who created a specific card, or perhaps the history of a specific card, that Madame M. Fox appeared in a starter deck in set 2 and has been never left the meta ever since, or cards that were popular once fell out of favor and they're back again, or Sisu being on ice or off ice or on ice. I also like talking about Disney facts and fun and when cards appear in specific movies, telling a story about why that movie resonates to me. Now, I know that these little personal details, some people like them, some people don't, but I really do think they make for a compelling broadcast, especially in a Disney TCG that is trying to tie back to specific properties, that is focused on art. I think it's important. And so the question is, how do you prepare for this? Because you obviously can't study all of this trivia, and the answer is really that this studying is ongoing forever. Just by consistently being around Disney Lorcana, by going out and meeting artists and talking to artists and watching Disney movies and just studying the game and being around it in general, you pick up these things over time, and that's how you can offer this bit of flavor as you're commentating. Oh, there's one thing I do need to mention. I should have mentioned this right up front, but as you're studying and learning in the meta and learning the gameplay and how people think, the best thing you can do, obviously, is to play the game. Now, I will say there's a bit of a caveat here. Actually, let's say 2. The first is that you shouldn't be expected to be as well tested as the competitive players going into these big events, because frankly, a lot of them are prioritizing this over almost everything else, and rightfully so. And so they're putting in thousands of games leading into this event and decks that they want to test and prioritize. And so you can't be expected to test that many. But what you should do is prioritize the decks that you are testing based on the knowledge that you need, based on decks that you're not familiar with, etc., or decks that you think are going to be very, very popular, so you can understand the scripts of those decks as best you can. So build the decks and prioritize testing the decks that you think you need to learn the most. The other thing I'll say this, and every competitive player will tell you this as well, when you're playing to learn, one of the best things that you can do is talk to your opponent both while you're playing and after you're playing. In fact, sometimes, even though you're trying to win, there may be decisions where you're like, I don't know if I should do A or I don't know if I should do B, and to look at your opponent, especially if they're a very good competitive player, and to say, hey, which of these in this situation would you like to see least? And let them tell you what they would prefer you do. I did this weekend when I bounced a particular character with Cloud Kicker, and I asked the player afterwards, I was like, is that the one you wanted me to bounce, or did you want me to bounce the other one? And he was like, no, you made the right decision. And so you have to talk to your opponent, because you have to learn from each other, and you have to diagnose the games. Just playing the game is great, but just playing the game without talking to your opponent to understand different lines, what they're doing, what you're doing, why they're doing certain things, isn't as good as it could be. So you need to talk to your opponent, and you need to learn that way. All right, and the final piece of this, I won't call it a phase, but the final piece of this is self-care. We were doing an interview with Frank Karsten, and he said, and I'm going to misquote him, but he said something to the effect of, going into a major tournament, he's never won more games than hours of sleep he had the night before. And I will extend that out to the week before, because at least for me, as I'm getting older, once I get into a sleep deficit, it takes me many, many days to catch up. So it's very, very important. Self-care is easy to forget about to prioritize studying and learning and watching streams over sleep, over eating properly and hydrating properly. So going into this weeks in advance, you need to watch your sleep schedule, you need to eat properly. Hydrating is so important. Just like a competitive player would, these are long days in the booth, honestly. They are grueling. And the bummer about it is, or not the bummer about it, but the interesting part is you are expected to be your best at the very end, because people are tuning into the finals, they're tuning into the end of a stream where the stakes are really, really big and expecting you to be energized and passionate and excited, when in reality, you've been doing this for so long, you're kind of at the end of your energy. And so in order to maintain that energy and to ramp up and to be the kind of commentator that your audience expects that they need in those moments, you have to take care of yourself, because it's really, really easy not to do that. And honestly, that is probably where I have failed the most. And speaking of that, I need to prioritize sleep right now because it's getting late and I need to get to bed in preparation for this weekend. So that's it. That's how I'm preparing for this weekend. And perhaps there's some tips there that you can take with you if you're looking to commentate a tournament, maybe at your LGS, or maybe you aspire to be a DLC commentator one day. Thanks for watching, and I will see you all either at the tournament or on stream.